Well, good afternoon. I'm Matthew Bishop, New York's Bureau Chief of The Economist, and it's a great honor to be talking with Brad Burnham, one of the founders of Union Square Ventures and one of the great players in this current wave of social media innovation. And I was struck by this blog post you did a while back where you talked about how we ought to view the network companies as countries, and that would be a very enlightening way of looking at it. And I tweeted beforehand to see which countries people thought they ought to be like, and people came back and said, well, Facebook is either China or the United States, Apple is Germany, or the Republic of Hollywood was the other answer I got back. Now you go for Facebook as Vladimir Putin's Russia in your analysis, which and that Apple is a monarchy, and I found myself thinking a bit about Louis XIV and l'état c'est moi, and maybe après moi le déluge. But tell us why you think that's an instructive metaphor and where that leads us.
The reason I think that's an interesting way to look at these is that if you think about these large networks of users, they don't really make anything, right? They don't produce a product, they don't. And they're not organized as hierarchical firms where somebody at the top can tell the people who are actually producing things, who are the users, what to do. The users produce stuff. So their job is actually more like that of a government trying to nurture an economy. They create infrastructure. So the equivalent of roads would be the bandwidth and the hosting and the server infrastructure. They create rules and adjudicate disputes between users to organize the activity on the site. There's obviously a government equivalent there. One of the most wild things that's happened recently is they actually provide for some equivalent of the national defense. Last December, two of these networks, 4chan and Tumblr, kind of went after each other, launching denial of service attacks. Now, it wasn't the people who organized the networks that launched those attacks, it was the users. And the people who are organizing networks were trying to manage that. But in fact, Tumblr had to invest a lot of money to defend itself, so they provide defense. They also try and manage things like spam and malware, which would be equivalent to sort of environmental management. And last but not least, these networks have to start thinking these days about a foreign policy. If you look at what's happening in China, the big networks that we see in the US, Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, none of those exist in China because they didn't agree to play by the rules. And so there are Chinese domestic counterparts that have emerged that are clones of those networks. And so, when Eric Schmidt decides to pull out of China, or when, Facebook decides they can't or are not allowed to enter China, these companies have to start thinking about a foreign policy, not just in terms of relationships with each other, but also in terms of relationships with their host states.
And I guess in politics, we've kind of accepted the Churchillian view that democracy is the best system is the worst system except for all the rest. I guess in America, there's a bit of a question about that at the moment, because I hear people looking fondly towards China and saying, I wish we didn't have all these annoying Tea Partyers to deal with. Let's just get on and solve things out. What do you think in the corporate world the model is going to be? I mean, is it going to be the sort of quasi-dictatorial Democrat of Mark Zuckerberg, or is it the monarch of Steve Jobs, or is there a different model altogether that will emerge, you think?
So I think that people actually, was it Oscar Wilde who said the problem with socialism is you have to spend all your evenings going to meetings? People don't really want to do that. They don't really want to get into the nitty-gritty of administering their daily lives. So they'd love it if somebody would do it for them. And I think there is some comfort in the fact that these networks are not, in fact, democracies today. They are benevolent or not benevolent. They are controlled. They're oligarchies in the sense that there's some group that controls them. The problem is the degree to which you can vote with your feet. If you could move from network to network, having these networks managed as oligarchies or dictatorships is fine, because you could just decide, I don't like where this network is going, I'm going to go to a different network. But in a world where there are real network effects, it's not easy to leave Facebook if all your college friends are on Facebook. And so if you don't really have the luxury of voting with your feet, because there are dominant network effects, I think we will start to see pressure for more of a voice among the users.
Now, here in New York, there's obviously been a lot of excitement in the past couple of years that this time New York really is a venture capital center, a place where real businesses are being created in the digital space and so forth. I mean, how real, how long-lasting is that going to be? And will it move beyond the touchy-feely kind of stuff to being, you know, real infrastructure and so forth, and real hard products?
I think touchy-feely is really hard to get right. So if you're describing hard as core, I don't think New York is going to go there. If your question is, do you think New York will continue to be an important center for application layer network innovation, I think that's absolutely the case. If you think about it, obviously New York didn't have much of a play in the core infrastructure world, but the people who, if you think about what's going on right now, Facebook's problem isn't a core technology problem. Twitter's problem isn't a core technology problem. I mean, lots of people would criticize Twitter as being very, very late to all of the core technology requirements that were kind of imposed on them by accident. The problem is not an engineering problem or an electrical engineering problem. It's a social engineering problem. And people who are interested in people tend to be interested in diverse environments, diverse people. If you look at the entrepreneurs who run Foursquare or Etsy or Tumblr here in New York, they don't want to live work in a cubicle in Palo Alto and live in Menlo Park in a subdivision. They want to be surrounded by more interest than that. And they don't want to be in a monoculture. They want to be surrounded by people and spend their evenings with people who aren't doing what they're doing. And so I think New York has a really wonderful opportunity to attract that kind of person, that kind of entrepreneur. And I think it will take that kind of entrepreneur to succeed at this, creating these experiences for people, which isn't ultimately a technology problem.
And there's been no competitive response from Silicon Valley shipping in interesting people or anything yet, is there?
Well, one of the wonderful things about Silicon Valley is you can get a house and you can put a zip line on the roof and tear the chimney down, which you can't do as easily in New York. So maybe they'll succeed there.
Now, The Economist, we have a bit of a reputation of being bubble heads, that we're always seeing bubbles. And one of my fondest memories of working with Chris Anderson when he was at The Economist was in March 2000, where he and I had a discussion about whether the NASDAQ would ever get back to where it was at the time. And I think I said it wouldn't, and he said it would. We've just put on the cover about 4 weeks ago, Tech Bubble 2.0, where we think, again, there is a pretty clear evidence of a bubble. And I think you share that view, and I'm interested to see how you see it play out from here.
So Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I think we are in a bubble. I think it's a very different bubble than the one that we were in the late 90s. I think that the results might be quite similar in the sense that in the late 90s, there was a huge amount of company creation. And when the dust settled, 4 or 5 interesting companies emerged as big, successful, sustainable businesses. I think we might see a similar thing happen here. I think one of the problems with the way the market is acting right now is that it's, I think the valuation of these businesses follows a power law. I shouldn't say the valuation, I should say the value follows a power law. And so at the head of that power law, that curve, you've got businesses like Facebook and Twitter. And I think those businesses are probably worth every penny that they're trading at in the secondary markets right now. But what's happened is the entire curve has been lifted. And there's a lot of stuff out here on the tail that is, in some sense, social media, but doesn't have the same defensibility that these big networks have, and is being valued, as a multiple of users on the same basis, but without the defensibility. And I think those are the companies that are going to be a problem.
And I mean, how do you see it ending? I mean, is it going to end in a sort of calamitous way that we saw in 2000, where suddenly everyone's cash, lines dried up, and you just burnt through whatever capital you had left, and then everyone died?
Yeah. So I, of course, have no idea how it ends. But one of the key distinctions between the bubble that we're in today and the bubble that we were in the late 90s is that it's much less expensive to start a company today than it was. There's an entire open source stack that you can build your company on top, and you can get a product into market. I think Foursquare had 100,000 users for $25,000. And so, you couldn't do that in the 90s. I think there's a much larger audience today for online services than there was in the 90s. There's a lot more people online. There's a lot more people familiar with using those services. So that's different. And I think that the other thing that's happened is it's a lot easier to get to consumers. Back in the 90s, everybody had this, retrospectively, naive notion that you could buy users. And if you just promoted the hell out of the service, if you get big, get fast, and there was an enormous amount of money spent on marketing. In the businesses that we see today, nobody's spending anything on marketing. It's all word of mouth, social media promotion. And so these businesses can be remarkably efficient. And so one of the things that might happen is we'll see a collapse in their valuation, but the businesses won't go away. In the 90s, when the valuations collapsed, these businesses needed so much money the next day that they went out of business. So it'll be interesting to watch.